As it is said in the Holy Bible, if you never change, you never grow. Me, 2022. This is why Kyoto Animation's history is so interesting to me. I think by far the coolest thing about going through most of their catalog over the last 2 years was constructing this elaborate timeline with eras and outliers, trying to piece together this vision of how their visual style has evolved over time. And now I'm going to share my findings with you, because KyoAni is cool and this gives me a chance to praise everything they've ever done in one video. Here's the timeline. I know it looks like a tier list, and that's because it was one. Alright, let's do this. So, starting out with humble beginnings, and by far the messiest part of this whole video, we have our first era, the producer era. I called it that because during this time, KyoAni was listed as a producer on almost all of the shows they worked on, not the main studio. Even so, you can see how a lot of them inspired the aesthetic of their earliest works. However, in 1992, they did make a show by themselves, and I kind of wish they didn't. This is Noroi no One Piece. Just look at this. I watched this while researching at like 1 in the morning, and I think it gave me nightmares. Which apparently is what it was supposed to do because it's a horror thing, but I didn't know that because I didn't read the thing when I was looking at it. Because again, it was 1 in the morning, and you can obviously tell this part wasn't scripted. So yeah, I'd say producer is a good fit for them right now. You've got shows like Tenchi Muro, Fancy Lala, and even a Ghibli movie, Pom Poko, rounding out their early library. But in 2000, they worked alongside Sunrise on Inuyasha. I don't know about you guys, but whenever I think about early KyoAni, this is what pops into my head. I see it as a very polished version of the 90s anime aesthetic, which is the bomb, by the way. The oval eyes, the long, wild and wavy hair, the thin line work, the simple yet super vibrant and expressive colors. Like, look at this poster for Inuyasha. The light illuminating their faces, the orange of the setting sun creeping down, the deep blues and purples of the mountain range and the sky behind them. This is so soothing and wonderful. I want to take a bath in this poster. Anyways, Inuyasha is cool, but it's also very long. I will finish it one day.
You're so beautiful, but so tiny. It would be a first for me, but I'm certainly willing to give it a try.
Try what?
Next up is Munto and Nurse Witch Komugi. I don't know a thing about either of these, and they look super weird. Ungrar, the king of viruses, has escaped from his prison cell in Vaccine World in order to pledge to my Patreon. Oh wow, how nice of him. Link in the description, buddy. Nurse Witch doesn't matter much though, since KyoAni was still just a producer. Munto, however, is our first outlier. An outlier is a show that I can't really justify putting into a specific era, and usually this is because the work they're adapting has a distinct style that KyoAni needed to match. You could say that this OVA planted the seeds for the next era we'll be getting to, these gigantic eyes being the biggest indicator of that, but I find it too rough and stylistically strange to call it definitively. Personally, I think KyoAni really began to hit their stride following what worked in Inuyasha, with Full Metal Panic Fumoffu. This is arguably their first true anime. They're the sole studio responsible for it, and it's a full 12-episode season. It had its own style that it needed to replicate, seeing as it was technically a season 2 for a show that was animated by Gonzo. As you can see, irises are now much larger. Hair has a lot more shading and bits of lighting attached to it, but ultimately I see these two as pretty close relatives. Something about the body proportions of the characters, the style and quality of the animation, they both have that same early KyoAni vibe for me. Alright, now with that out of the way, things are going to start making a little more sense. This next era is what I'm going to call the Key era, as it's made up of several adaptations of visual novels by developer Key. The first of which was Shit. The first of which was Air in 2005. Now, compare these two character designs and let me know if you can tell what the defining characteristic of this era is. I'll even give you a hint. I think that it's the eyes, yeah. They're huge, they're spread out super far, and there's so much going on inside of them compared to other eyes we've seen before. It's something that's often very off-putting to people, but I find that the feeling goes away pretty quick when the characters are brought to life by KyoAni's exceptional animation. I've always dubbed these things as portrait eyes, because if you look deep into them, it kinda looks like an abstract painting rather than an iris and a pupil. This is also the start of the sassy and sensible male protagonist gets wrapped up in the antics of a bunch bunch of cute girls style of storytelling, which means we see a lot of similar scenarios and actions between these shows, deepening their visual connection to each other further. It's something that'll continue with the melancholy of Haruhi Suzumiya, but before that, it's nice to see Munto finally get its act together with Munto 2 Beyond the Walls of Time. Despite it being a much more out there story, I think it shares similarities with Air in a few ways. The colors are similarly subdued compared to something like Full Metal Panic. Shadows are simpler and lighting on hair isn't as crazy as it was before. The eyes, while not resembling the portrait style very much, are similar to how the main character of Air, Yukito, is portrayed. These sharp, stern, two-line eyes connected by a white oval, which gives off this kinda too cool for school vibe. Full Metal Panic, the second raid, looks like Full Metal Panic. You could call it an outlier, but I just lump it in with Fumoffu as an extended continuation of the producer era. Alright, now we're at Haruhi. Look at those big beautiful portrait eyes. That, along with the, again, reserved use of color, is what still plants us in the Key era. And about the color, it's a lot more stylized in this season, kinda like Inuyasha. Like how in Closed Space, everything gets this deep blue tint to it. I think that's super cool. This is also a great example of how KyoAni used CGI in their earlier years. Usually they didn't really try to hide it when they knew they couldn't. Inserting stuff that just looked like real objects was par for the course with them. With stuff like spaceships or gigantic evil camel crickets, they reinforced the foreign and unnerving vibe they're supposed to give off. CG is also used in some shots that would be ludicrous to animate by hand, and they still hold up pretty well today. Cars, on the other hand, never look good in CG, and they never will in my opinion. Also, I think the body proportions of the characters is this show's biggest connection to the producer era, something that'll carry into KyoAni's second key adaptation. A lot of what Haruhi changed about Air was carried over into canon. Body proportions are the same, even though some characters are just tiny because that's the way they are. Haruhi's weirdly gigantic mouth lives on through Makoto, and colors and backgrounds are more detailed. I especially love the way early evening looks in this show. The warm colors casting themselves upon this snowy little town, it's fantastic. Also, I don't know if it's just me, but the portrait eyes look like they're getting larger and more vivid. Next up, we have a big outlier, Lucky Star. I did not crack this case, it was sent to me like that. This is a great example of KyoAni adapting a distinct art style perfectly, but as a one-off thing where they don't adopt parts of it as their own going forward. If you read the manga for Lucky Star and then watched the show, you could easily tell that you're still experiencing Lucky Star. It's just moving and rapidly approaching your location. You could argue that the chibi style inspired the eventual moe revolution they would have, where they made everything all cutesy, and trust me, we'll get to that. But I always saw Lucky Star as like, what if Nintendo made Wind Waker, but then never used Toon Link for anything again? DS games never happened, Smash Bros never happened, it's just this game. And then they moved on to Twilight Princess like it never existed in the first place. Or, for the sake of this metaphor, Clannad. I think Season 1 of Clannad is the culmination of everything that stood out about the Key era. More improvements to lighting, detail, and colors, still got those portrait eyes, and we've got kind of a middle ground in proportions, where they aren't bulky like Full Metal Panic, but they also aren't super skinny like Air. Also, I'd like to draw specific attention to the backgrounds. Throughout this era, KyoAni has had almost a watercolor-esque style to their backgrounds. Everything that isn't a foreground object has had the line work removed from it, so it almost looks like a painting. I find that this style works especially well on trees and plants, and when they get animated, dude, it looks like a moving Bob Ross painting. It's wonderful. But as much as I love this style and everything that goes with it, as Clannad would say, things change. And KyoAni couldn't even wait for Clannad to finish before switching things up again. Clannad After Story marks the birth of what I'm going to call the moe era. And if you think you don't know what moe is, you do. Less rigid, more rounded characters to make them look more cutesy. Complicated movements and zoomed out shots show characters in very crude yet stylized ways. And yes, this was the era where KyoAni forgot how to draw hands. You can see some of these differences by comparing screenshots, but I think Sunohara in episode 3 is the perfect example. First of all, he does this, then this. And if you still aren't convinced, to look me in the eye and tell me that he would have made this facial expression in season 1. You can't. Look at him. Dude's as squishy as he is caked. Next one up is an interesting one. Haruhi season 2. A lot has changed in 3 years.
Well, about 3 years ago.
I'm a little sick of hearing about this 3 years ago crap.
We can see the final breath of the portrait eyes being taken as the last of their unique Milky Way looking pattern fades away. The elements are still there, but they all look a little too closed off and defined in my opinion. The low detail blob stuff is brought back from After Story. Like look at this shot where Kanon waves his arms around. Jesus. I can't say I really care for this style too much, but I will say there is a lot more polish in this season compared to the first one. Most medium to close-up shots of characters look absolutely spectacular, and the coloring and lighting looks much more realistic. We've still got those watercolor backgrounds too, hopefully they don't go away anytime soon. And finally for this era, kind of, we'll talk about it later, is the big boy. Kanon leaned into this aesthetic the most by far. Even their damn instruments look cuter than the real thing. No drawing in this show is allowed to have a straight line. Clothes aren't allowed to have straight lines. Mugi's ridiculously strong arms aren't allowed to have straight lines. Yui and Azusa aren't allowed to be straight. I feel like they struck gold with this era here. Unlike Haruhi or Clannad, I would fully expect these characters to just blob at any given time. But even when this visual style is at its strongest, KyoAni still makes their characters undeniably human with these fluid and, for lack of a better word, relatable movements. Ritsu messing with her hair in the morning, Yui checking her mailbox while it's all cold outside, and of course, the bits where they actually decide to play music. Rotoscoping is a bitch, but it pays dividends. Thanks for the inspiration, Haruhi. So, we have an era with more defined and lifelike character designs, and another more cartoony style that excels in attention to detail even more than the former. KyoAni must have known that Kanon was peak moe, and they needed to branch off again from there. So what they did was combine the best parts of the previous two eras to create by far my favorite of their visual styles. And because I think it's the best thing ever, I'm going to call this the Metal Gear era. But also, for the sake of clarity, I guess you can just call it the refined era. It's an era that I think started back in 2010. Not at home, but in the theaters. The disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya is still the best thing that has come out of the anime industry in its entire history. That is not up for debate. What is up for debate is which era this movie's visual style fits under, which is clearly more important. I think that even though the refined era doesn't really kick off until the spring of 2012, this movie still deserves to be its first member. Like I said, best of both worlds. More rigid and defined characters like in the past, but a much more realistic and detailed style. Check out this random screenshot I just grabbed off of IMDb. Look at all the individual creases in their clothes and how they all cast their own shadow. Look at the photorealistic trees and buildings out the window that still miraculously look perfectly at home in this animated world. And don't even get me started on how fluid this shit looks when it's in motion. I could gush about reflections and complex movements in slow motion, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I did what I came here to do. I already talked about why this film is perfect for over half an hour. We gotta move on. Nichijou is obviously an outlier here. Unlike Lucky Star, I've actually read the original 10 volumes of the manga, so it's much easier to appreciate the way KyoAni faithfully translated its art style into animation. Kanon Season 2 is more Kanon, except you can tell by the way everyone looks that they're slightly older. I think that's pretty cool. And then Kanon the movie is like that, but British. Alright, Hyouka, the first TV show member of the refined era, and by far my favorite of the bunch when it comes to its visual style and basically everything else. Combing through the patch notes, we see that a small buff has been given to Nex, making our characters look a little taller. It shares the same details I've defined as refined. Damn, that rhymed, I'm out of my mind. What makes it stand out from the rest of the pack is its commitment to its own unique style. When I close my eyes and imagine classic literature or mystery novels, Hyouka's evocative color palette of warm greens and browns come to mind. It's like an old rocking chair you loved sitting in at your grandparents' house. Its dull appearance also reinforces the gray lifestyle its main character follows, something that's constantly juxtaposed with the bright and vibrant cherry blossoms that symbolize the possibility for a different path. Beautiful show, watch it if you haven't. Alright, most of these refined era shows are just that, but with small unique spins on the formula, so forgive me if these go a little quick. Chuunibyou does this really cool thing where the line work is this shade of brown rather than the standard black. The only other example of this I can think of are those Pokemon Omega Ruby animations that are super well made and just absolutely deserve the like 20 Brazilian views they have.
Here's a game-breaking EXP share.
There are lots of moe elements, and ironically a lot of shonen ones too, because the fights are freaking fantastic. You're all gonna laugh at me for suggesting this because it'd be literally impossible, but I would cry tears of joy if KyoAni ever announced that they were doing a true adaptation of Berserk. Tamako Market is kind of an outlier. If anything, I would consider it to be a part of the moe era, because while Chuunibyou was borderline, this show outright embraces the moe aesthetic of Kanon, probably because they have the same director, Naoko Yamada, and also because it fits really well with the vibe of the show. I feel like the biggest thing going for it visually is the wealth of colors on display in the shopping district. Everything feels so alive and welcoming here, which is exactly what they were going for. Free is refined era for sure. Those muscles and that jawline would give Tamako Market a heart attack. Other than that, there isn't much to it. It borrows Hyouka's style, but is pretty bland all things considered. Kinda reflects the show itself. For Beyond the Boundary, its unique spin on things is that it looks really pretty. Like, even the box is gorgeous, look at this thing. I really like all the magic stuff and the cool color palette. Thumbs up. Chuunibyou Season 2 is exactly the same as the first season. The only change is we learned that pink is a natural hair color in this universe. Tamako Love Story is Tamako Market, but with the contrast cranked up to 11. It has the same style and level of detail as the show, but now with much darker shades of color to emphasize the more mature subject matter of the story. I know that being confessed to and feeling conflicted about it doesn't sound like a world-altering event, but it is for these guys, so... Amagi Brilliant Park is colorful like Tamako with body proportions mostly like Hyouka. Mostly. Yeah, I'd hate to shatter any worlds here, but a huge part of KyoAni's style is fan service. Granted, Amagi uses it for comedic purposes a lot of the time, and it is funny. But what about Full Metal Panic? What's Kaon's excuse for the maid outfits and the cat ear shit? Who told these boys to keep their shirts off as much as humanly possible? Oh, but not our KyoAni. Couldn't be precious KyoAni. Tell that to these thighs and Sunohara's ass, bro. Hibike Euphonium has its own spin on the refined era by making everything super glossy. Eyes sparkle like diamonds, everyone's cheeks and kneecaps are as rosy as Santa Claus, and the lighting goes crazy in this show. I'm all here for it. While I think I prefer Hyouka's more subdued style, this works great for the story it's trying to tell. It brings a lot of idealistic imagery to these dull settings, making you feel like these mundane activities are the most important things in the world, mirroring the level of commitment the characters in the show feel towards this ultimately pointless hobby. The Beyond the Boundary movie is the show, but somehow prettier. Phantom World sucks. Oh, what's that? You're telling me that this is Myriad Colors Phantom World? Not anymore. But anyways, it's a refined era show through and through. And it takes the Chuunibyou line art, which is pretty neat. I like how two of the more magical shows use this unique line art to stand out from the other less weird anime. Next up we have an outlier, and a small teaser for what's to come. A silent voice doesn't really match up with anything else. The super thin and insanely detailed line work combined with the washed out colors really aid this film's sense of identity. Despite all the beautiful scenery that surrounds this film's characters, it never feels like they're allowing themselves to take it all in. I think you know where I'm going with this. The manga, when it was colored in, shared this washed out color scheme, so I think they both had the right idea here. Also, about that teaser, our main character Shoya is really tall. I thought he was like 27 when I first watched this movie, but apparently he's that minus 10 years. Anyways, go watch this film, it's fantastic, and we're moving on. Our final stop on this super long era is a little anticlimactic. It's Hibike Season 2, and it looks exactly like the first one. Now we're entering what I'm going to call a lull period. It lasts from the end of 2016 to the beginning of 2018. KyoAni had two shows, and Free, that aired during this period, and they're both outliers. Dragon Maid is just like Nichijou and Lucky Star. A super unique style is matched to perfection by KyoAni's magic touch. You also see a lot of remnants of the moe era in this show, which is pretty cool. Baja's Studio is a one-off OVA featuring featuring Baja, who is Baja. I don't remember a thing about it. Looking at it now, it kind of looks like Dragon Maid. Everything feels so loose, fun, and wholesome. It's nice. And now we're at the final era, which I've dubbed the new era because, well, we're nearing the end of the video and I was bound to stop trying eventually. Listen, the Bluebird is the perfect starting point for this new era because of one thing. Everyone has a giraffe neck now. Look at Nozomi in this movie and look at Nozomi in Hibike. Ignore the art style change and just look at body proportions. I hope you see why I'm making such a big deal about this now. Also, Liz is super cool. It's got a weird fairy tale-like art style. Kinda like those storybooks you had when you were a kid, which, say it with me now, is the entire point. Chuunibyou Take on Me by Aha is Chuunibyou again. The characters look a little taller and everything leans a little less on the moe blob side and a little more on the quote-unquote realistic side. It might be the Tamako Market syndrome where the stakes are higher than the original show, so there was a slight change in style to match it, or they just got a little older, I don't know. Violet Evergarden has some giraffe neck, especially in its first film, Eternity and the Auto Memory Doll. Like Hibike, the show heavily leans into the glossiness of everything, and once again I think it works in KyoAni's favor. This is probably the most beautiful thing I've ever seen except for every time I take a look into a mirror. Oh, by the way, Free is still airing. Tsurune is what really solidified the giraffe neck thing for me. Liz had a distinct style, and Violet might have been a one-off thing. But seeing it show up in another recent KyoAni show was good enough for me. Also, the line work for these shows seems to be getting thinner and thinner as time goes on. They actually leave gaps in some places in this show, which I think looks cool. Next, we have Chikai no Finale. Hibike's characters are taller because they're older, and yes, their necks are longer. After coming back from the horrible year that was 2019, KyoAni released the absolutely stunning Violet Evergarden movie. Its visual style is consistent with the show, but since Violet is older now, she's taller, her hair has more detail, and her facial features are more spread out. It's a good look. Watch this movie if you like crying. And finally, we have Dragon Maid Season 2. I've been underselling a handful of sequels that don't significantly change up the visual style, but I can't do that for this one. It looks so much more detailed and fluid than Season 1. Some shots are so unnecessarily impressive, like this water glass one here, and don't even get me started on the fight scenes. Again, One Piece, Berserk, Dragon Ball, I don't care which one it is. If KyoAni wanted to animate it, it'd be the coolest thing in the world, but for now, we do have a bit of a vision for where they'll go from here. Tsurune Season 2 begins airing next month, which if this video gets out on time should be tomorrow. Happy New Year, by the way. Hibike Season 3 is gonna be awesome. Can't wait to see more of Clannad. And finally, there's 20th Century Denmoku. We got a CM for it, which was neat, but other than that, we know nothing about it. I could read the light novel to find out more, but that would be reading. Thanks for watching, everyone, and a special thanks to Silent Secondary, Mr. Chocolate Salmon, and the rest of my wonderful patrons.